What is the interest in true crime, and why is it apparently women are way more interested in true crime than men?
It's a huge difference. People say it's because women can identify with the victims in those stories. And it's most of our greatest fear, probably, to be sexually assaulted, murdered, in these horrific ways we see. After my mother divorced my father, she dated this other man for several years. He lived with us. Shortly after they split up, he ended up murdering his next girlfriend.
There were more people studying serial killers than there were serial killers.
There wasn't this serial killer epidemic that was going on. There was Ted Bundy and there was John Wayne Gacy, and there were these very high-profile killers, but, you could name them on one hand. So it really wasn't the epidemic that it was made out to be. The size of the attention they got, made it seem like it was.
How good are the FBI Behavioral Science Unit scientists there at profiling? I mean, does it work? When does it work? When does it not work?
My research shows that it really doesn't work, at least not in the way most people think. There was a study done in London that found that only about 2.7% of profiles led to the capture of the murderer. There was another study done that found that sophomore chemistry students were more accurate in their predictions of who a killer was than the homicide detectives that they compared them to.
All right, everybody, it's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. This episode is on criminal profiling. Oh, my God, this is one of the most interesting topics we could possibly cover. My guest is Rachel Corbett. She's a features writer at New York Magazine, and her writing has also appeared in The New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, and Atlantic. She lives in Brooklyn, New York, and is the author of You Must Change Your Life, which won the Marfield Prize, the National Award for Arts Writing. I'm going to have to ask her about that after we talk about her new book. I have to change my life? What if I like my life and I don't want to change it? Anyway, we'll get to that later. Here's the new book, The Monsters We Make, Murder, Obsession, and the Rise of Criminal Profiling. Rachel, nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on to talk about this super interesting topic. I usually start the show by asking my guests, how they got interested in this particular topic. In your case, this is, central to how you got into it with your own, personal experience. That is not a pleasant one.
Yeah. So when I was a child, after my mother divorced my father, she dated this other man for several years. He lived with us. He was kind of an early father figure to me. And shortly after they split up, he ended up murdering his next girlfriend. And this was a complete shock to me because he was always this kind, very quiet, gentle guy. He was never violent. He hated violence. In fact, in one instance where there was violence, he fled the scene. Years later, I learned of the murder. When I was a child, I was only told that he had also killed himself. And when I found out about the murder, I was so shocked, and I wanted to understand how this person could have done this thing. I couldn't reconcile the crime with the man that I knew. And so I was in my early 20s, and I was just studying to become a journalist, and I took a very investigative approach to this case, if you want to call it that. I went and I called the local police departments and had them kind of walk me through what they found. I talked to sociologists about the phenomenon of murder-suicide, trying to understand what kind of person does it. I even met the boy whose mother he killed, and went back to the house with him. I tried to approach every angle, and I ended up feeling like I just didn't really understand it still at the end. He did kind of fit the demographic features for somebody who commits murder-suicide, but it still wasn't him. It was like, okay, this is him, but not the one I knew, not the man I knew. So I left feeling kind of like maybe this approach doesn't work. I became very interested in the approach. I was writing a sort of profile of Scott, but my profile didn't feel satisfying. And so that's how I kind of got into the idea of profiling as a concept. And I came at it thinking initially that it was a very powerful tool. And I wanted to understand it. But then as I got into the research, I found that criminal profiling is a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, a lot more complicated. And at the end of your book, you're still not satisfied with an explanation. And I think the direction we can go with this is that there is no explanation ultimately, because there's so many exceptions to the rule, and the N is so small of people actually commit homicide compared to the overall population, and even compared to the people who fantasize about killing other people, which it turns out lots of us do. What is it? 70% of males and 60% of females have at some point in their life fantasized about killing someone they don't like, but 99% or whatever don't ever act on it, right? So the problem is you've got this tiny, tiny, tiny little N, and it's like, how do we explain that? And that is a hard problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a phenomenon that's been overblown. In like the 1970s and 80s, the FBI was putting out all these statistics saying there are 4,000 to 5,000 victims killed every year by serial killers. When actually historians looking back said actually it's more like 400 or 500 per year. And there wasn't this serial killer epidemic that was going on. There was Ted Bundy and there was John Wayne Gacy, and there were these very high profile killers, but you could name them on one hand, maybe two. So it really wasn't the epidemic that it was made out to be. But the size of the attention they got, made it seem like it was.
Yeah, at some point somebody said there were more people studying serial killers than there were serial killers.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah. I just had Caroline Fraser on the show. Her book is called Murderland. I don't know if you've read that about.
I haven't read it yet, but I'm familiar.
Oh, it's a gripping story. She's such a good writer. Like you, she's a really good writer. That's why I like reading books by professional writers and journalists, because they're highly readable. Hers focuses on this kind of cluster of serial killers in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, and early 80s, associated with the Pacific Northwest and all the industrial waste, lead, arsenic, and all this stuff. Of course, the problem is the same one you've encountered, is that what about all the people that were exposed to these industrial waste products and they never did anything weird or violent, right? Or the people that were serial killers and had perfectly normal upbringings. They weren't exposed to industrial waste. They had two parents, and they weren't beaten, and so on. It's the counterfactuals that always throw us off.
Yeah, it's in my opinion, from my research, it's a lot of factors that go into making somebody a murderer. There's everyone kind of not wants to know, is it nature or nurture? But it's both. And within nature and nurture, there's many categories within that. There's genetic factors, biological factors, neurological factors, all kinds of environmental experiences that can go into it. I had never heard of the toxic air being one of those factors. Or I don't know if it was I don't know exactly what it was.
Well, lead poisoning is associated with a reduction in prefrontal cortex activity, which is the brake on your emotional impulses that bubble up from the amygdala. That's the theory.
I see.
Yeah.
So maybe if you had that accompanied by like childhood abuse or something like that could be the toxic.
And randomness. Just, random stuff happens and no one has any idea what it is. You went left instead of right. You had the upper bunk instead of the lower bunk, or you saw a black dog, or I don't know. Who knows? I mean, there's like 1,000 things that happen that differ every individual from every other individual.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly the problem in profiling, is people don't want to accept the randomness. They want to know, they want certainty. And it's why, when we have these serial killers, we have to know what the motive was, or not even serial killers, like, Brian Kohberger, the Idaho student murder. He refused to talk in court or explain why he did it. And, everyone was enraged by this. And even President Trump's press secretary said, if he doesn't tell us why, we're going to make him tell us. Because, of course, someone just being crazy or it just being a motive we can't understand isn't acceptable to us. That makes us feel very out of control.
The problem in that case, well, in many of these cases, he may not know why he did it. So intimate partner violence is that the number one? If a woman is murdered, that's the number one reason. It's intimate. It's by somebody she knows.
Yeah, especially in murder suicides, it's almost always the female partner, or the children, unfortunately. And I think that's why, it's actually men are more likely to be victims of homicide.
Yes, by other men.
by other men, yes. But with sexual violence, certainly it's women who are the victims. And
Yeah.
Women aren't killing men at the same rate. That's
No. Yeah, the number one predictor of violence is maleness for starters there. Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, because I pulled up some quotes from David Buss's research on he's the one that did this study on, have you ever let's see, what was the exact question? Have you ever thought about killing someone that you disliked? And he recorded the results in his book, The Murderer Next Door, Why the Mind is Designed to Kill. And it was like 91% of men and 84% of women reported having had at least one vivid homicidal fantasy in their life. One man who acted on these fantasies from a group of Michigan murderers whom Buss studied said he killed his girlfriend because I was deeply in love with her, and she knew that. It infuriated me for her to be with another guy. Jealousy is a common motive, is evidenced in another case in which a man flew into a jealous rage during sex with his wife. Why? According to him, she asked him, "How does it feel to fuck me right after someone else has?" Well, okay. He strangled her in bed. I mean, these are just horrible stories. But some of the ones were like undergraduate students at the University of Texas at Austin, right? So these aren't like criminal people in prison. So one woman said, "I had this vision of putting poison in his food. My imagination started from the moment when he is back home and went for his bath. I would put the dinner on the table and take out 2 separate bowls for the soup. One bowl of his will contain rat poison. Without suspicion, he will finish the soup. Then I visualize him suffering stomach pain. Then white bubbles come out of his mouth, and then he collapses." Of course, this never happened, right? These are just... and then another woman, let's see, there was one where the boyfriend threatened to release their sex tape publicly, and so she imagined killing him. I'm trying to find it. It's actually a funny story where he's completely clueless until she grabs a knife and then he runs away. Anyway, yeah. So, I mean, you get the idea there. So the question is, why do some people act on it and others don't? And that's what criminal profilers want to be able to tell, right?
Yeah, well, yes. Or in their case, they're really looking at it from a law enforcement perspective. So they're thinking, who's our guy? Is it going to be someone like this or someone like that? The psychiatric professionals would be more interested in, what makes somebody, what life factors shape them. I think that the detectives try to stay away a little bit from, what was their mother like, or this,
Yeah, yeah. Well, so you use that phrase, at risk. So let's just go over what the state of criminal profiling is. What are some of the at-risk factors they would look at?
So in criminal profiling, what they would do is they would take a crime, and they might even look at the crime scene itself and say, what are the behavioral markers here? What does the choice of victim mean? What was there some kind of gratification that was satisfied in this event, or the psychological fingerprints, they sometimes call them, and then try to understand the motivation often that way. And profilers specifically look at murders that are more irrational. It's not a robbery or something very obvious. And so they've compiled data over the years about the kinds of people who commit certain crimes. So they like to say, was it a disorganized murder or an organized murder? Was it premeditated or impulsive? And that will tell you something about, if it's impulsive, maybe this guy also can't hold down a job. And if it's not, maybe he's someone who blends in society better. And if every bomber in the history of America has been a white male, then we should start looking at white males if we have a bombing, that kind of thing. They in the FBI, they started creating these typologies while interviewing serial killers in prison. But the problems arise when you have police doing psychiatric work, and then it's psychiatrists already have, and researchers already have their own body of data for much of this stuff. But there really wasn't much overlap in, using each other's resources to work together and solve this problem. So I think a lot of those early interviews were maybe didn't lead to the conclusions that they hoped. And the disorganized, organized thing has been kind of debunked as a concept that really is relevant.
What are some of the other things like that didn't work out? And go ahead and give us a brief history of criminal profiling, which you do in the book, which is so to start, like Henry Murray at Harvard. I mean, these are some fascinating studies that lead to some incredible stories about, MKUltra and mind control and the CIA and Charlie Manson and it's just wow.
I know it was a tangled web how all these things kept coming together. It was like, it's like I'm not.
Ted Kaczynski too. That was another one.
Yeah. So, I trace criminal profiling back to Victorian England, when Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, was kind of enlisted by someone in the police to help identify Jack the Ripper. And of course, he was a fiction writer, not the investigative detective. So he tried to get into Sherlock Holmes's hat and, try to think of the killer through his lens. And, he wrote a bit of a profile that didn't turn out to be particularly accurate. But the reason I started the book there is because I felt like this overlap between fiction and true crime was so evident. I think that's been part of the history the whole time, but you really see it right at the origins. A novelist writing about helping police with a killer. And this happens kind of again and again. In fact, the FBI agent John Douglas, one of the most famous ones who wrote Mindhunter, said that Sherlock Holmes is, the antecedent to profiling, and that they've all read his books. And so it continues the kind of lore. And then, of course, we have this constant narrativizing of crime in pop culture with the TV shows and the podcasts, and it's always entwined with the story somehow when we talk about it. So so to go back to your question, I traced the history through then into World War II, when this guy Henry Murray you mentioned was a psychologist at Harvard. He ended up carrying out what was considered the first leadership profile or political profile, as the CIA calls them, which is when you look at a foreign leader, often a dictator or tyrant. In this case, it was Hitler, and profile them and try to predict their next moves. So Henry Murray profiled Hitler and made all kinds of conclusions about what he would do next in the war. He might try to martyr himself, and or he might kill himself, which in fact he did. And then, that would inform the military operations of the U.S. And then, then I look at sort of the birth of profiling in the FBI, which is when it really became popular in a mainstream way. And then up to the present with predictive policing and data-driven policing and algorithmic policing, which is mainly how we do profiling today.
Yeah. Okay. Let's dissect some of that. Yeah, because when you hear things like, Chicago or Portland, like today, are, under siege and there's these, hellholes of crime. But when you go to these cities, you mostly see nothing. Most of the crimes happen in just a couple blocks. Like if you go to that intersection right there, like 60% of the crimes happen in that block right there for whatever reason. The gangs hang out there, drug deals are made or something like that. So that's that smart policing. So just put a squad car there. Or, back to the Bobby's, Robert Peel's idea of putting police on the street and just walk around as a deterrent.
Mm-hmm.
That's an early idea that took on.
Yeah, and that's still very much in practice today. Let's just send cops all the time to these areas. That was one of the early kinds of data policing, the geographical kind, which is, in fact, it was actually an anthropologist who studied earthquakes in Iraq or somewhere in the middle, somewhere. He studied earthquake patterns. And he said, earthquake patterns are just like crime patterns. When you shoot someone, there are all these reverberations around it. Then somebody else shoots someone. Somebody else shoots someone, like revenge or whatever it is. And so he decided to kind of map that onto cities. It was like a very intriguing concept, but it ended up leading to a lot of people being policed who really hadn't done nothing wrong, and then got, kind of roped into the system as a result.
So is Arthur Conan Doyle the sort of the first true crime author?
Well, no, I mean, there's Edgar Allan Poe, who's
right.
creating the detective with his Dupin series. That's considered the first detective. I don't know, and of course Doyle was fiction, but Sherlock Holmes was fiction, but Doyle, see, I confuse them myself. I remember which one is which, the fiction and the nonfiction writer. He did eventually turn to solving crimes himself. Shortly after this Jack the Ripper episode, he got involved in what he considered a wrongful conviction case and tried to exonerate a man. And he did switch over at one point later in his life, which is interesting.
He's an interesting character. I wrote about him a little bit. When his son died in the First World War, he turned to theosophy and came to believe that the soul lives on somewhere and that you could contact them through seances. And so he got into all that stuff. And then he befriended Harry Houdini, the great magician.
Yeah.
And Harry was like, none of this is true. These are magic tricks. I'll show you how they're done. Except he didn't show him exactly how it's done. Right. And there's one famous story about this where he had Sherlock Holmes they were in somebody's home, go down the street and write something on a pad here and then put it in your pocket and don't show it to anybody. And then so he does that and he comes back. He goes, okay, now just write down a phrase. So, and then Houdini has like this chalkboard and he's got these little balls that he dips in an ink pot. And then they're just stuck on this chalkboard. And then they start to draw out something. And it turns out to be the exact phrase that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote on this piece of paper that no one saw. And Doyle is like, oh my God, you have the magic, the real magic. He goes, no, it's a magic trick. And I'm not going to tell you how I did it. I'm just telling you it's a trick. And he's like, oh.
If you don't tell them how they do it, then, you can keep believing the magic. That's hard to.
Well, yeah, there is something to that. I mean, the Amazing Randy was always fond of saying he didn't want to show how to bend a spoon because there's half a dozen different ways to do it. So I show you the one way and you go, well, but the guy I was watching, he didn't do it that way. So he must be the real spoon bender. This is the magic trick spoon bending, right? I mean, it's a fascinating thing. There's something about like close-up magic and mentalism that fools people into thinking there might be something really to it. Because I'll always ask people, do you think Copperfield like literally walks through a wall or he literally transports the Statue of Liberty atom by atom? Well, no, I know that's a trick. It's like, okay, then when Uri Geller bends a spoon, why don't you think that's just a trick?
Yeah.
Something about that.
What is that? There is something about the mentalist, the power of that's slightly different from.
Well, and mentalism tied in back to your book, they do some profiling. I mean, a lot of it is just cold reading where you're just saying things that are true for most people. Like you have a scar on your knee or the number 3 in your address, and you have a Post-it note on your fridge and you're missing an earring, or in your case, maybe I'd say you wore your hair longer when you were younger or whatever. You had a white dress. What does that mean? Oh, I went to my prom, or you had a red car. I just throw stuff out and then you're doing the reading, right? But then there's other things where you could sort of look at somebody if you're doing a live reading and you profile them, you're about this age, you're wearing a wedding ring or you're not, you're wearing these kinds of clothes, like Sherlock Holmes, right? So he had calluses on his hand and he had these kind of mud on his boots, or he had these kind of clothes. I could tell he was, a workman, or he was a soldier, that kind of stuff. Some of that actually can work.
Yeah, I mean, he tells that great story, Doyle does, and I'm sure you know, about his old professor, which is what he kind of based Holmes on. His old professor who would do it in front of students in class. It was a medical professor. You have someone come in and he would say, like, you're from the Caribbean, you're from this island, or you're from, you have this disorder and you're wearing this. So he could analyze everything. And then he even diagnosed him before he even really said what the problem was. And there were always reasons that he then explained to everyone. But it was, I mean, Doyle saw the magic of that.
Yeah.
Medical scrutiny.
Yeah. Okay, so how good are the FBI behavioral science unit scientists there at profiling? I mean, does it work? When does it work? When does it not work?
Well, so my research shows that it really doesn't work, at least not in the way most people think. There was a study done in London that found that only about 2.7% of profiles led to the capture of the murderer. There was another study done that found that sophomore chemistry students were more accurate in their predictions of who a killer was than the homicide detectives that they compared them to. So it's really more of a art than a science, and it's more of an illusion. I think really a public fantasy more than it is a science. Also, there are aspects of it that I think are useful. If you really don't know who a suspect is, you've got to narrow it down with something. So, with Ted Kaczynski, there was not a shred of physical evidence anywhere. So maybe it was wise to start looking at, well, again, bombers, white men, probably, they would be educated. It didn't lead to his capture, of course, but the brother is ultimately who turned him in. But it's certainly like there's other cases. I think thinking psychologically was a good advancement for the FBI. That kind of in a general sense. There's also a famous case where one of the first cases the behavioral science unit worked on, where there was a young girl who was murdered, Susan Yeager, and the lead detective, the not profiler detective from the FBI, an agent, I should say, looked at this crime, and he was told who the suspect. He was given a tip about who it might be, but he met the guy, and he was normal. He was kind. He was quiet. He didn't have any of the scary murderer, properties. And then he took a lie detector test, importantly, and he passed it, no problem. But the FBI profilers came in and they said, no, psychopaths can be very calm. They can pass lie detector tests, that lying doesn't bother them. And ultimately, this was the killer in the end. So, things like that, knowing more about human behavior, I think is, of course, useful.
Yeah. I was like watching the Body Language guys. They had that podcast. By the way, let me just ask generally, what is the interest in true crime, and why is it apparently women are way more interested in true crime than men?
Yeah, it's a huge difference, especially with the podcasts, and the TV shows. People say it's because women can identify with the victims in those stories. It's most of our greatest fear, probably, to be sexually assaulted, murdered, in these horrific ways we see. So there's something about feeling in control of that narrative. If you watch a show that wraps up a crime in 42 minutes, you get sort of a bite-sized understanding of why they did it. It feels like, okay, now I really know how murderers think. Maybe I won't end up in that situation. Or maybe it just feels like, I think it's resolved, and you feel satisfied. You feel like you've kind of taken control of the narrative. And I think that's what they feed us a little bit. Of course, it's a false sense of security. So it does. I think it's a bit of a tricky phenomenon. But I also watch those shows, so I can't really be too critical.
Well, I guess the evolutionary theory is that women are more risk averse for obvious reasons, size differences, sexual assault, and so on. And so they have to be more attuned to the kind of cues in the environment that are proxies for threats, whereas guys are just, kind of bumbling around and clueless to a lot of these things.
Yeah, I think that's why women cross the street. Women know always who's around them, at any given time. I don't know if that's, yeah. So I'm sure that's part of it. Like, but they're actors, so it's a bit, on the shows, it's a bit, maybe you learn something,
But even in study of intuition and rapid cognition, women seem to be better at this than men in terms of just like picking up subtle cues. The word intuition is a little misleading. It's this kind of rapid cognition system, system one that Kahneman called rapid cognition. Just, I don't know what it is, but I have a bad feeling about this group here, or this room that we're in, or this space with these people. I'm not comfortable. And the guy's like, what? All right. So something like that, I think.
yeah, that makes sense. you're talking about thinking fast and slow. That's what, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the CIA's hired those people with, exceptional intuition to consult with them and predict when
Yes.
ships might sink and all kinds of calamities. So I don't totally understand the science of it myself, but I guess.
Well, a lot of it is after the fact. If you know the person lied, then you go back and look at the videos, the famous one of Clinton. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Oh, look, he looked to the right and then he held his Coke can in a certain way. Or there was the one with Lance Armstrong where he's denying that he doped after we know that he doped, right? Then it's like, oh, look, he's counting with his thumb. And that's a sign of like, so anybody that does this when they're counting means they're lying? What? No.
Yeah, no, that's body language shows are a whole thing too now. That's like and lies, how did you tell a lie? It was a series for a while.
Didn't you report in the book that, right, even criminal profilers trained in lie detection are really no better than chance or barely better than chance?
Yeah, well, I don't know about lie detection per se, but with in terms of naming who given two options, who's the murderer, given their characteristics, they're no better at
right. Oh yeah, that was it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So back to Henry Murray at Harvard. I mean, this is post World War II. The United States is worried about the Russians, the Soviets, and the Chinese and the North Koreans getting ahead of us in mind control technologies or psychologies. So we've got to do something about this. This ultimately leads to the CIA's MKUltra program. But, there's kind of a logic behind that. Maybe there is something to psychedelics and controlling people or truth serums, and you can get them to talk, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, they tested all kinds of crazy things on people that were successful from that perspective. They got people to, they were trying to get them to kill on command and do all kinds of things. And, psychedelics are powerful, but I don't know. The problem I think was their choice of subjects, the fact that they didn't tell them there were subjects,
Yes.
tested on people.
They would not pass an IRB review board now.
No.
Yeah.
Which was bizarre after World War II and all, when everyone was creating all the ethical rules around medicine, and after Mengele and the Nazi experimentations, somehow it just went right out the window in the U.S. after that. But yeah, I mean the MK. It's one of those things where it's like there's conspiracy theories around. Ted Kaczynski was considered, very paranoid person. Although when you learn about his background and the CIA research, he seems a little bit less paranoid.
So what do you think? Do you think he was, because he took a course from Murray at Harvard, and he participated in the experiments where they were doing stuff to him, right, without his consent.
So Henry, sorry.
Is it possible he wasn't actually schizophrenic? He had his brain fried by these experimenters.
Yes. Well, I think that, given his age, he was there at 16 and the study started at 17. He might have been schizophrenic, but, something may also trigger vulnerability like that. Or he was at that age when something could be triggered, either depression or, another psychiatric condition. So probably he was, my guess is he was predisposed to something anyway. The stress of that experiment didn't help and maybe pushed him farther along. It certainly made him rageful. Anyone would be enraged after undergoing what he went through at Harvard. And it was around that time that he started having fantasies of revenge, of moving away into the woods. He also wasn't well. That's clear, I think. But I think again, it's this combination of factors. And Henry Murray was after he finished the Hitler profile, he brought a lot of his research on spies. He did stress tests. He tried to break spies just to make sure that they wouldn't, break under pressure, that they wouldn't give up information. And then he ended up bringing that to Harvard and just testing it all on his students, undergraduates. And with Kaczynski, the specific study he was running was about humiliation. And he wanted he had all these students write essays about their their most personal beliefs, what they value most in life, their philosophies, and also divulge all this personal information about their parents' sex life and what they knew about it and all kinds of weird things, their fantasies. And then he used that information, gave it to an older law student who then berated their essays like point by point. He just tore them apart and made them feel stupid. And then, and this went on for years. So Ted Kaczynski is a 16, well, at this point, 17-year-old. He's the only working class kid from Chicago. Everyone else is a Harvard guy. And so you can imagine it was probably a pretty traumatic experience for him.
Mm-hmm. My favorite part of that story in your book is the linguistic fingerprint that gave him away to his brother, David. What was the phrase? You can't have your cake and eat it too?
Yeah, exactly. The inverse of the way we normally hear it.
So funny.
I know.
All his writings, it's like that one stood out.
I know. Because it was a guy who never made any mistakes. His manifesto was meticulous. There was not a typo hardly, So it seemed like a mistake, but in fact, that's a phrase. I guess that's how they used to say it. It's an old-fashioned version of the phrase. So yeah, I think any error was stood out to that FBI agent who was looking for anything, any clues in this, massive text of the manifesto. And that was a kind of that agent, James R. Fitzgerald, was a profiler, but he used a different kind of profiling in that case, which was linguistic profiling, which was, when you look for regionalisms or certain terms that may be used in, to age you, date your birth and all of that. And that ultimately did end up leading to the arrest warrant to go actually get Kaczynski. So, in a way, profiling worked there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, now there's these computer programs that you can put text into, and it analyzes the kinds of language or that sort of emotional words that appear more than on average, that kind of thing. In fact, it was used to show that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. This is during the Shakespeare authorship controversy, which is a big conspiracy theory of these. I don't know if you've encountered these people, but they are out there.
Yeah.
That it was anybody but Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. But Shakespeare scholars have since been able to put all the text into these computer language analysis programs and go, oh yeah, this is the guy. He wrote all of these and so on. Anyway, I think that was kind of interesting. Yeah. So then the other one, Manson. There might have been a link to MKUltra with him also. I don't know how much you followed this. Tom O'Neill wrote this book, Chaos. Have you seen it? Have you read that? Or
yes, I know of it, but I haven't read it. Yeah.
Well, you could just watch the Netflix documentary called Chaos.
Okay.
It's based on the book, and Tom O'Neill's in it. Or you could watch the 3 hours on Rogan where he goes through the whole thing. And it's a kind of frustrating. It's like a 500-page book. It's a good read. But at the end, he says, in the end, I found no smoking gun. I couldn't prove that Manson was part of MKUltra. And it's one of these, again, after the fact, but it's this kind of explanatory gap. How is it he got these women to commit these murders and he wasn't even there? Right. And, this was the point of the Bugliusi's book, Helter Skelter, that he had the problem of making sure that Manson was convicted for murder, even though he wasn't even at the crime scenes. And that doesn't let the women off, that they're still culpable also. And he managed to pull that off. So Neil's puzzle is like, it doesn't seem like sex, drugs, and rock and roll is enough to get people to commit murder. But again, these are, teenage girls that he pulls out. They're fatherless or they've left home. They're runaways. And, it's kind of a cult, the cultic practices that, to me, it explains it just fine. But, there's this other element where Manson's parole officer had a link to the MKUltra people and maybe even Murray, I think, where they kept letting him out. It's like they kept arresting him. He just keeps committing crimes. They keep arresting him and then let him go. It's almost as if somebody said, he's working for us. Let him go.
Yeah.
It's weird.
Maybe. I mean, Henry Murray was Timothy Leary's supervisor.
Yes, that's
so and it is impossible to link things to MKUltra because they got rid of all the files. So we can never really know what was officially part of it or not. But the CIA was funding all kinds of things like this at universities, and we know the drug research. So even if it wasn't, it's still a shocking piece of that history.
Yeah. Okay, you're right about the Jekyll and Hyde problem. What is that?
So I think, this concept of duality was something that's always been very terrifying to people.
Mm-hmm.
This is why Ted Bundy is like the ultimate nightmare, because he's looks one way and acts another. And we, throughout history, have decided that we need to be able to see what a violent person looks like, what a threat looks like. And so in the beginning, that was very literal. They used phrenology to say, okay, well, if you have certain shaped skull or your nose is a certain way, then you are most likely going to be a criminal. Of course, that's nonsense, but it really put people at ease, particularly at this time in London, when there was all this immigration from the Industrial Revolution. So people were coming from other countries that looked very different, sounded very different. So, and, probably unsurprisingly, it was those kinds of faces that were most likely to be deemed criminal. And that's gone on really throughout history. So now we don't use faces, but we use these behavioral markers and say, oh, well, if you're a fatherless child, or you have an incarcerated parent, or you've done X, Y, or Z, then you might be a criminal, or you live in this neighborhood, and whatever it is. So we kind of still try to mark people, and I think it's that inability to really like accept that we just don't really know, and that's the Jekyll and Hyde thing. That's why I think that story was so popular and terrifying to people, because it was, that's our greatest fear. Someone who looks like a doctor, healer.
Right. Right. Or they just look normal, or they look like a bureaucrat, like Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Or Rex Heuermann, the latest guy.
Who's that?
Rex Heuermann's the guy they just arrested like a year and a half ago for the Long Island serial killer, they call him, at the Gilgo Beach murders. Right. He was an architect, who he did look a little scary. He was like a giant, but he talked normal and all of that. He was a business guy, so.
I was like, when they interviewed the neighbors of these guys, what was he like? He was a quiet man.
Always. Oh.
A nice guy, yeah. Yeah, well, because the level of the evilness of some of these crimes is so bad that you want something to stand out in balance of it, to make cognitive harmony rather than dissonance. In conspiracy theories, we call this the sort of imbalance between cause and effect, in which you want the size of the event to have a equally sized cause. So 9/11 was caused by 19 guys with box cutters, or JFK was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, this loser, nobody. It just doesn't feel right. Princess Diana, drunk driving, no seatbelt, and speeding. That's how us regular people die, right? But a princess, there must have been some plot. Yeah. So I think it's something like that. We wanted Eichmann to look like, I don't know, just with horns, or the equivalent of that.
Exactly. And that's what I say when I say it's a bit dangerous to get too into these shows or feel like we're learning something or feel safe, because, Ted Bundy knew very well that people weren't going to suspect him. He even says, like, they think I have to be drooling in order to be a murderer. And he fully took advantage of that. He could just walk right up to women and, have them help him put things in their car. And so, what can we really know or detect, when someone's like that? I don't know.
Yeah, I didn't realize how much of the Silence of the Lambs was based on actual real accounts of, like, again, can you help me put this couch in the back of my van, and those sorts of things.
That what I haven't seen that movie in a long time. Is that what he does in that?
That's what he did. Yeah, he had a fake cast, and then he waits for the woman to pull up, at their apartment or whatever, and he's like, I can't go on, and she looks over. That was based. I forget who.
Exactly, Bundy. It's exactly what Bundy did.
Yeah, that was a Bundy thing.
Crutch or a cast, yeah.
Right, yeah. And he was good looking, right? So that made a difference, I guess. It's a bit disarming.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting just how profound that dissonance is, I think, in people. Because even the judge in the Bundy case, who sentenced him for this murdering a child in horrific ways, said, like, I don't hold I don't hold anything against you. Like, you would have been a great lawyer, partner. And, I'm sorry you went the other way. But almost like he knew factually he did the crime, but it was almost like he couldn't treat him as such. He couldn't hold on to that feeling that this is a monster because he looked so unlike a monster.
Oh, I've seen that. There's, I think, the Ted Bundy tapes. I think it's on Netflix.
Yeah.
They show the judge say, it's like, what? Are you kidding me? I don't remember what this guy did. And he escaped twice. He escaped the one. I mean, he's represented himself. So he says, okay, I need to be alone in a room with my notes to get my head clear. Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead. Go into that room by yourself. We'll just let you go. Out the window he goes. Like, are you kidding me? Twice.
And then he got married in court and then had a baby. Somehow he had a baby.
Okay. Do you have an explanation for this, by the way? Like, the Menendez brothers, how many, they're married and how many wedding marriage proposals they've had? I mean, come on. What is with that?
Oh, women falling in love with men in prison.
Yeah.
I don't know if they can fix them. They'll be the ones to.
Okay.
I mean, or, it's the way to be close to something really dangerous and fascinating, but you're safe because they're in prison.
Oh, I see. Oh, right. Yeah. It's weird. Yeah. Luigi Mangione. Oh, he's so handsome. Really?
He's probably got, I don't know how many marriage proposals that man has got. I mean,
crazy.
Even Ted Kaczynski got his first girlfriend ever in his life while he was in prison.
Really? Oh, no.
He had a relationship with a woman for years. I mean, they wrote letters, obviously, and they had a relationship for years. And she got sick with, I think, cancer. And then he was really devastated and tried to raise money for her and all this.
Yeah.
A lot of types.
I had Jim Lampley on the show. Jim is a HBO boxing commentator who I knew when I was bike racing back in the 80s on Race Across America, covered by ABC Wide World of Sports with Jim Lampley. Anyway, he wrote a memoir. So I had him on the show for that. And he's talking about all the interesting people, that he knew, Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali and George Foreman and OJ. So we got to talking about that, and it's like, what was OJ like? He's like, oh my God, this is the nicest guy, the most fun I've ever had. You just cannot believe what he did. And he went on and on about all the time they spent together. And I used to go over to his house with Nicole, and just everything is great. And then that happens, and he's like, what? This can't be. And then the trial is unfolding. He's like, oh my God, I guess I didn't know him. And then, so then we got to talking, well, you did know him, and he was the way he was. But he was also a jealous stalker. He stalked Nicole for years, because we have all those 911 calls where he's back, who's back? You know who? OJ, he's back, and so on. You can hear him screaming in the background. Right. So then I recounted, there's another Netflix documentary. You could tell I watch a lot of Netflix about the OJ murders. This is the latest one. In the episode 3, they interview his ex-agent at the end. And the agent says after the murder, he was acquitted and so on. And he has to sell Rockingham House. And they're just sitting in by the pool, having a beer, whatever, chatting about the old days. He says, OJ, can you just tell me what happened that night? And OJ says, what do you think happened? And then the agent recalls thinking, well, if I was a good agent, I would just say, well, I know you would never do it, OJ. And he goes, but you know what, OJ, I think you did it. And OJ said, if Nicole hadn't come to the door with a knife that night, she'd still be alive. I thought, whoa, that's incredible. So maybe, again, back to, people don't even know why they do the things they do. Maybe he just went over there just regularly stalking her like he did.
Normal stalking. Yeah.
Normal stalking. And then he sees Ron Goldman in there. He's this handsome guy and whatever. And he just loses his mind. And then Nicole's like, oh my God, OJ's back. And he's trying to break in, grabs a knife to protect herself. And then he gets in there, and then the knife switches places. Because he's a huge, massive guy. And then he just loses his mind, kills her. Then he jumps in to protect her, kills him. And then the whole thing is over in like 10 minutes and he's gone. Right?
Yeah.
And so is he a murderer? Well, yeah, he murdered 2 people. Yeah, he's a murderer. But not by nature. It's not like he's walking around for 30 years like, I got to kill somebody.
Yeah, I mean, so whatever was making him a stalker, whatever inability to regulate his emotions or deal with it, was already putting him like maybe at the edge of closer to doing something than somebody else. And then just that impulsivity, I guess, and the fear of was she going to stab him? I don't know. Or just the fear of getting caught. I can imagine there's so much going on in that moment. But that's kind of the disorganized killer, the version of what the FBI would say,
Oh,
that's one category.
so organized would be planning ahead.
Planning ahead, maybe taking souvenirs, objects, and
Mm.
going after a very particular type of victim and watching them and making sure it's a perfect crime scene, there's no evidence and all of that. I don't. Yeah, it does seem like if OJ, he wouldn't do it when the other guy was around if he really wanted to. I don't know,
Right.
plan a attack, but
Yeah.
or
It's just it seems like a different crime entirely, a serial killer versus a one-off. You look at the Ted Bundys and the others, they did really sick, twisted things. It's not like I just raped her and killed her. Like I kept her alive for 3 days and I kept raping her and then I cut out her organs and I did this and that. It's like, wow, this is completely different.
yeah, I mean, that is and that's kind of what the FBI behavioral science unit was created to sort of account for. That's the very irrational murders category. Like what on earth would make someone want to do this thing that would be absolutely horrifying to everybody else? Yeah. Yeah. Oh.
I mean, yeah, there's something broken in their brain. You have like the Charles Whitman, the Texas school shooter from the tower, and he had a tumor in his hypothalamus or something like that. And he even said, there's something wrong with my brain. He left that note. Sure enough, there was.
Right.
But maybe it's not just tumors. Maybe it's like you can't see on a brain scan somebody's 20 years of horrible upbringing and being dropped on their head and being beaten and drug abuse and who knows what else.
Yeah, and the amygdala, as you mentioned earlier with Murderland, that book, that could be the same thing, that they damage maybe they're getting beat up as a kid and they bump their head in the wrong way and it disables their impulse control or whatever. That can be, maybe it shows up, maybe it doesn't as a lesion, I don't know, or there could be a little cyst somewhere that just changes everything. But then usually I think it's something like, okay, you have no impulse control, but then you have to be also maybe an angry person or maybe a person who needs a lot of dominance and control. And then, so you already have a few characteristics that line up. And then without the impulse control, that's what makes you actually do it. Or a few other.
Yeah, because I don't need impulse control I have a fine functioning prefrontal cortex, but I don't have those thoughts bubbling up going, oh, I gotta put the brake on there. I'm going to rape and kill somebody. It never even occurs to me to do that. So there's something else.
Yeah, there's something else. Yes. It could also be like paranoia. Someone thinks they're being followed or watched, or someone's giving them a bad look. And then all kinds of, some psychiatric disorders play a role. Yeah, I don't think I could kill a person if I was trying to save my life.
I know, it just never enters my mind to do that. I had a guy writing me, prisoners write us all the time here at Skeptic because they want free stuff because they got nothing else to do, right? So, but one of them was writing me about the death penalty. He was on death row in Massachusetts, I think. And he thought this is a bad idea. That's a shocker. Anyway, so it's like, what did you do? And he said, oh, I raped and murdered a woman and this is what I do. And he goes, so I said, well, just explain to me, what's going on in your head. And he said, this is the way it is. When I see a woman, I just want to rape her and kill her. That's it. I just can't control it. He says, it was so bad that even after I was convicted and I'm in the van driving to the prison, like locked to the seat with armed guards sitting there in the van with him. He goes, I see a woman walking on the sidewalk when we're driving along, and all I could think of is, how can I get out of this van and get to this one? Like, holy crap. That is a broken person.
No kidding. Yeah, then you got to go into like, what did his mother do to him that made him hate women so much?
Right.
It turned, someone's really out of control at some point in their life too.
Maybe he was an early incel.
Well, incels are, Ted Kaczynski was an incel too, I think. Yeah, that's like a upcoming category of.
I know. So let's talk about that. So what is an incel and how could that lead to crime?
Well, I think there's this a sense of entitlement that you're supposed to be able to sleep with women and then an enormous rage that follows against women. again, I don't think it's just because you're ugly, you're going to be, or something, you're going to become an incel. But, in Kaczynski's case, he was sexually frustrated to the extreme, so much that he considered getting a sex change operation, not because he felt like a woman, because he wanted to touch a woman's body. I mean, how crazy is that? And he tried to take a woman on a date once, and she rejected him, and then he wrote all these mean notes about her all over the place. I mean, it's this rejection, this fear of rejection. There's another case that I think about sometimes. I don't know if you know, what's his name? Larry something. He was a Civil War reenactor, and he killed in the South, and he ended up killing all these women, but no one thought it was him because he was a little bit slow. But what it turned out was that he would kind of kill them. He would strangle them from behind. Like, he didn't actually want to see them die. He didn't want to hurt them. And then he had sex with them like right after, so they were still like warm, and it wasn't like a necrophiliac thing or a sadistic thing. It was his only way to be with a woman that wouldn't reject him. Like, he can't stand that rejection, so they have to be dead almost. I mean, that's like the extreme.
That is really weird. Yeah, that's a weird one. But again, these are so unusual, and there's so few of them. It's hard to compile a database of the characteristics that represents that to profile them.
Yeah, and without having insight into their lives, and many of them are not willing to. A lot of them say there's nothing wrong. I was raised in a perfectly nice home, and
right.
Ted Bundy said that, which is pretty much impossible to believe. I do think something has to happen to you.
Yeah. Well, so another one of these great debates, nature nurture, is the situation versus it's in the person themselves. So like this was Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. We randomly assigned these college kids to be guards or prisoners based on the flip of a coin. So there's this sort of control versus experimental group division there in the protocols. And then, but then now this has been called into question that he coached them a lot. He kind of coached the guards into being a little more aggressive, maybe. But they still did it, and the weird thing about that when that came out right before Phil died was, a lot of these guys that were saying this now, like, I was just playing a role because he told me to. But you could see earlier interviews with them over the years. This happened, in 1971. And they've been interviewed a gazillion times because it's the most famous experiment in all of psychology. And they were going, oh, yeah, I totally got into it. I couldn't wait to berate this guy. I was just living it. I loved it. And then now they're going, oh, yeah, I was just faking. It's like, oh, come on. Which is the real you, right? So,
yeah.
But Zimbardo's a deeper point, I think, in his book, The Lucifer Effect, because a lot of what he saw in Abu Ghraib was very similar to the Stanford prison experiment. It's like, aha, okay, there's something real going on here.
Yeah, which is also similar to Nazis, people have argued, taking orders to do atrocities. And I think he even looked at himself and he said, what, I'm the prison superintendent. What was I getting out of sort of lording over all these people and directing them this way? Was there some motivation in my own head? Which is an interesting thought too, Why did he conduct that study?
I think most of us could go a long ways toward evil under the right circumstances that you think you wouldn't. When I used to lecture on the Stanford prison experiment or the Milgram shock experiments, my students, oh, I would never do that. You don't know that you wouldn't do that.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's many, many examples of whenever a whole population agrees to do something horrible, I don't think there's something exceptional about us.
Yeah. So these aren't broken brains, right? These are, normal people that under the right circumstances could be cajoled or talked into doing something like this. We did a replication of the Milgram shock experiment for Dateline NBC with Chris Hansen in 2010. We did this. So we had we constructed the box with the toggle switches, from 15 volts all the way to 450 volts. And the setup was, instead of a learning experiment, it was a tryout for a reality TV show that NBC was going to air called What a Pain. And the question was, could you, deliver these shocks to this person in the other room under these learning conditions? Because we want to see if you want to be on our show. So it was not hard to find people that wanted to do this. And most of them went all the way, the first, actually the women were more disinclined to do it than the men. But yeah, it wasn't hard. But again, the setup was, this is a television production company, and this is NBC Studios, and we have a producer sitting here telling them you must continue, because they were distressed, like, are you sure I should be doing this? This is, you must continue, and so on, the same script that Milgram used. And so, but the criticism of Milgram is, well, yeah, but these are people that think, well, this is Yale University and you're a professor. I can't really actually be killing somebody, could I? I mean, they're just, this is NBC Studios. Come on, they're not going to let me actually electrocute somebody.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess that's one excuse. But I mean, I remember in the real experiment, I remember it went pretty far. They were screaming in pain. Like, I mean, people were still doing it. I mean, and Abu Ghraib, obviously, like, you dehumanize somebody enough and you'll do anything. There may be certain people who really want to be. Joseph Mengele was a particular type, but other people can be complicit and certainly create the situation for that, I think, if you're able to dehumanize somebody enough.
Yeah.
Which is the whole culture does, yeah.
Another good doc on this is called Ordinary Men, based on Christopher Browning's book of that title, Ordinary Men. These were slightly older men in their 30s who were recruited to be police officers as part of the Einsatz group, and SS soldiers that went into Ukraine, Eastern Poland and Ukraine, after the German army went through and beat all the Soviet soldiers. And their job was to kill all the Jews in the towns. Okay. And, at first they're like, oh, okay, well, I don't know. I don't really want to do this. And they weren't forced to do it, but you could kind of see it unfolding, that there was a lot of social pressure. Like, don't be the guy that lets the other guys down. None of us really want to do this, but here we are. Fuck it, let's just go take care of it, and then we'll get drunk afterwards. That kind of thing. It was more of a, don't let the group down sort of pressure.
Yeah. I mean, the social bonds that form around these situations, and then you add like a pretext, like if you're in the military or you're a police officer, like then there's you're upholding a bigger mission. It's for something. So, and Henry Murray did these tests on people too, like trying to, what makes a good soldier, and he would put them in situations and terrify them and, stress them out and make them worry, and then to see how they would react to others, and would they take it out on somebody else? Would they, and it's, yeah, I mean, I think people can be made to do a lot of things, basically. And, and this psychiatrist in my book, Dorothy Lewis, she's so fascinated in violence because she thinks that she, in another life, might have been a serial killer. She feels there's something in her that might have been that. And she's Jewish, and she says, I think if I were in Nazi Germany, I would have gone along with it too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit like the trolley problem, where, would you throw the switch to divert a trolley down a track to kill one worker, because at the moment it's going to kill the 5 workers? You're probably familiar with this. And most people in the thought experiment go, yeah, I would flip the switch and kill the 1 worker to save the 5. It's just a pure intellectual exercise, right? But would you throw a fat man, as it's called now, it's a big person, off a bridge to stop the trolley that's going to kill the 5 workers? And fewer people are willing to say, I would physically throw somebody off a bridge. You got to grab them and throw them off. There's something more visceral about actually doing it.
Yeah, that's why people talk about Hitler, like, well, he never. I don't know if this is true, but I've heard people say he never killed someone himself. So, is he even considered a murderer? What he maybe enjoyed the domination he had over his own people as much as he enjoyed the subjugation of the Jews or whatever. What is that? There's all kinds of levels of pleasure and also horror at that same thing.
He liked little kids, and he had a German Shepherd he loved.
Yeah. And he was a painter.
Yes, right. Yeah, so that book that Murray wrote on Hitler, what was it called? The Analysis of the Personality of Adolf Hitler. Yeah, it's like, how much can you really profile somebody that you'd never even met, right?
Yeah, that analysis that he writes is pretty intense. He says at one point that he studied 2,000 metaphors in Mein Kampf, and from those metaphors deduced that Hitler liked to be urinated on by women. like that. Like, how you know that condition? I don't know. And he knew all about
Crazy.
the sexual dynamics between his parents, and that, you know, I think it is known that Hitler's father was a really brutal
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
He
He
didn't
was.
beat the mother, and I'm sure that had something to do with it. And he speculates that he so hated his mother's submissiveness in that relationship, and looked up to the father's domination, and then that was part of his. And then there was, I think he correctly identified a lot of projection in Hitler, that Hitler would talk about. I guess he used to stare at people right in the eyes. It freaked them out. It was an uncomfortable stare. And then sometimes he would talk about how Jews, look at you in this way that they try to scare you or something like that. Like it was always something in himself that he attributed to others, which we see a lot.
I haven't read that book. And he also wrote Explorations in Personality. What was that about?
That's a massive, massive book.
Yeah.
Done it for years. He didn't complete many of his projects, but the idea was that he was a personality specialist. So he created this field called personology, which is not a term we use now, but he wanted to identify sort of every feature of a person that what makes Michael. He thought he could just really atomize it. And so he took a student called Ernst and tried to do this. It was supposed to be a book about personality, but he ended up just kind of trying this extreme experiment on a student, and started trying to code all the different types of personalities. And he wrote lots of essays about the personality as well, and a lot of it hasn't held up in research wise, but it was considered a really groundbreaking book just in its creativeness and bringing forward the personality as a subject of study, certainly. But it also shows Henry Murray's kind of grandiosity, that he thought he could do this. He thought he could, break somebody down into parts like that, and be the one to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
He never had a psychology degree, by the way. So everything he did.
Wasn't he a chemist or something like that, right?
Yeah, he was a surgeon and a chemist. But he underwent analysis with Jung at one point, and for a few weeks, and that's where he felt he learned all he needed to know to then become the head of the Harvard Psychology Clinic, which is extraordinary. He was probably a bit of a sociopathic charmer, in my opinion.
A little Machiavellianism, a little psychopathy, maybe.
Yeah. And then to say, and he always did the exact opposite of, he wanted to save the world from Hitler, and he wanted to create a new personality that would be anti-nationalist. He believed he could engineer these personalities in people. And that was part of the body of research that he did on Ted Kaczynski. He wanted to create a more evolved personality, but everything he did in his work was about breaking somebody down into, and making them the opposite of that. And if you look at what happened to Ted Kaczynski, it's the farthest extreme from what he said he was setting out to do.
Yeah. Well, the big personality theory today is the Big Five, which is 5 general categories of OCEAN, OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, disagreeableness, and then neuroticism, or emotional regulation. And most people, these are pretty good tests, but really it's just kind of like, how introverted are you? Well, it's a scale, right? It's a spectrum. I'm on the spectrum. And you can nudge it around. You can kind of get yourself to be more extroverted. I'm going to go to the party tonight. I don't really want to, but I'm going to go, right? Yeah, you could kind of change your personality. But there are certain characteristics that represent you, Rachel, that's different from me on these Big Five, that are mildly predictive. But yeah, it's not physics. This is the problem with social scientists have physics envy. And it's just,
and there's so much that's about the language we use to define them. There may be emotions we have that we haven't even named yet, or that in another language they have different emotions. Apparently in China they have a different set of emotions, even based on what they name things. So this idea that you can, this is again our obsession with naming and identifying and predicting, this, everyone's a whatever, the INTJ or
well, that one hasn't held up too well. Yeah.
Still,
all of these, the problem is self-report data. We don't know what's in somebody's head. If I ask you how shy you are, you're thinking I'm this, I'm a 6, and I'm thinking, well, I'm a 3.
Yep.
But it's like measures of pain. The doctor doesn't really know how much pain you're in. You just, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad's your headache today, Rachel? Oh, it's an 8. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the best we're going to do.
Yeah. An 8 might mean something completely different to you than it does to me.
Yeah. All right. As we wrap up here, just a final point here on the problem of criminal profiling in particular, but profiling of any kind in general, on when the N is so small. This is called base rate neglect. So let me just read you this. This comes from Steven Pinker's book, Rationality. It's going to sound a little off the beaten path here, but it isn't. So a patient is diagnosed with cancer that has a 1% prevalency rate. That is, it happens to 1 out of 100 people. The test sensitivity for this type of cancer is 90%. That is, the test will be right 90% of the time. The false positive rate of the test is 9%. That is, the test will be wrong 9% of the time. What is the percent likelihood that the patient has cancer? All right, almost everybody says 80 or 90%. And with this test, and comes from Kahneman's original research, when you ask medical professionals, they also get it wrong, way wrong. They're like 80, 90%. The actual rate is 9% on those numbers. Here's how. Okay, the correct answer is 9%. In a sample of, let's say, 1,000 people, 10 have cancer. That's the base rate of 1%. Of these 10 people, 9 will test positive. That's the 90% sensitivity of the test. Of the 990 people without cancer, 89 of them will test positive. That's the 9% false positive rate. A person tests positive. Does this person have cancer or not? Here's how to compute the answer. Out of 1,000 people tested for cancer, 98 of them test positive in all. That's the 89 that have it and the 9 that actually have it and the 89 that don't have it. 9 of them have cancer. 9 divided by 98 is 0.09 or 9%. So here's how Pinker extrapolates that to this problem we're discussing. Why can't we predict who will commit suicide? Why don't we have an early warning system for school shooters? Why can't we profile terrorists or rampage shooters and detain them preventively? The answer comes out of Bayes' rule. A less than perfect test for a rare trait will mainly turn out false positives. The heart of the problem is that only a tiny proportion of the population are thieves, suicides, terrorists, or rampage shooters. That's the base rate. Until the day that social scientists can predict misbehavior as accurately as astronomers can predict eclipses, their best tests would mostly finger the innocent and the harmless. That's the problem.
I had not heard of that way of thinking about it. That's really interesting. But yeah, I mean, then that's I think what we see. Our predictions are so much about ourselves and what we've experienced in the world and what we expect to be.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem with applying it to human beings. And
well, and the other problem is our brains are not wired to think statistically on large populations and factor in all these probabilities. And does someone have cancer or not? What is this 80% cancer? You either have cancer or you don't, right? But we're not thinking about a person. Really, it's that's the trick of the little thought experiment. It's in 1,000 people. Yeah, but I'm not thinking about 1,000 people. That I just want to know, do I have cancer or don't I? But that's not how. Yeah. So.
Yeah, exactly. You can't pick, for the purposes of fighting crime, you have to target individual people.
Right.
And you can't do that if all you have is data about a group or, what might be the case. And that's happened a lot of times with really bad outcomes.
All right, Rachel. There's the book again. Here it is. The Monsters We Make, Murder, Obsession, and the Rise of Criminal Profile. By the way, I really love that cover with the fingerprints. That's
thank you.
Yeah, I enjoy it.
Debates about that cover, so I'm glad.
You did?
Yeah.
All right, Rachel. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Super interesting. Really good stuff. All right.
Yeah.